A pleasure to have my friend, Sanford Schram, otherwise known as Sandy, to talk about his new book, The Trajectory of Trumpism, talking about racism, fascism, and beyond. It just came out with Oxford. Sandy's written extensively over the years about welfare and race, and from a critical perspective. He was involved with our journal. And now he has this book on Trump. We have as our discussants, Alan Mandell, also old friend, emeritus at Empire State College, recent emeritus, State University of New York. He's long edited an important journal on mentoring, been involved in critical policy studies activities for a long time, is basically, among other things, a sociologist of education. And we have Jerry Mitchell from Baruch College, also in New York, and he's currently working on AI and public policy. We add Ian Reifowitz from Empire State College, focuses on American history and politics, I believe, and has a new book called Riling Up the Base. And Pobsook, Chamchong from the Chiang Mai University School of Public Policy, as well as our colleague Piyapong, Boossabong from the same school. So that's a lot. We go till 5 because it's late there in Chiang Mai. We will stop promptly. And so one important thing to do is to keep the questions and answers as brief as you can. And with that, I turn it over to Sandy. The floor is yours.
Thanks. Well, this is a delight. Glad to meet you all. I can't resist saying, so I'm retired from CUNY, and I teach as an adjunct now in the fall at Stony Brook, and I have to drive up Nichols Road all the time. It's about 20 miles from my house here in West Hampton Beach. And there's a sign that says Empire State to the right.
Really?
So I feel like this is like a neighborhood chat. Anyway, it's great. It's great to meet you all, and hear what you are all doing. And I'm new to this. This is really sort of like the second or third time I've talked to people about my book as it's coming out. It came out last Friday, it got printed. So I'm very anxious to hear what people have to say about it. I'm sure I got some stuff wrong, and I want to hear about that. Because there's going to be another printing. I might be able to change things a little bit. But so that would be very useful. For years I studied political language. I talk about this in the preface of my book. It started when I was a freshman in college, and my book's dedicated to my freshman English teacher who had me read Orwell's essay on politics in the English language, and it made such an impression on me as a freshman. And for years, I was interested in how people use words in politics, especially to demonize people and try to subordinate them. And I ended up one sabbatical. I went to Madison and spent a year studying with Murray Edelman, who wrote a lot about political language for years. And he was like a great mentor to me. And I was influenced by Bill Conley and his work on language, and Michael Shapiro, and so on, who I'm still in touch with. So there's a long line of people who influenced me. Like Frank was saying, I largely focused on issues of poverty and welfare and race and the demonization of people on public assistance. But when Trump came along, I felt obligated to sort of get on board with that challenge. And because a lot of his rhetoric was very similar in like punching down and choosing subordinated groups to demonize in order to uh, misrepresent what was going on, especially regarding issues of the economy and growing inequality and a lot of things that he really didn't want to talk about. And so I ended up writing a lot of essays over time, like for Public Seminar and Common Dreams and outlets like that. I had a piece in the Washington Post at one point. But then I decided I should write this book, and retirement has its advantages. I had a lot of free time, and I sort of quickly put it together. I was hoping that it would come out before the election, but that didn't happen, and Trump won, so I had to rewrite the whole book again. It's been quite a challenge, and so I'm very anxious to hear what people have to say about it. So, in some ways, the book broke new ground for me. My older son is the chair of anthropology at the University of Sydney, and he's a linguistic anthropologist. And we got to talking about this, and he encouraged me to consult the writings of Michael Silverstein, the linguistic anthropologist, who coined the term metapragmatics. And I started doing all this reading, and I found out that there were other people, in particular, Aurora Donzelli, who I think now is at Sarah Lawrence College in New York, that were writing about how Silverstein's idea of metapragmatics helps us understand how Trump talks and how that helps him normalize his extremism. And that became the main theme of my book. And so it's been like a learning process for me. I keep learning. Even this morning, in getting ready for this, I was reading some more stuff by Silverstein that I hadn't even thought of that I could have included in the book. That it makes it, one concern I have, it makes it seem like Trump's a savant. Like he's like a very sophisticated cultural anthropologist, linguistic analyst, though I suspect that's not the case. But we can talk about that. But it's been very effective, I'm afraid, that a lot of things that we thought were beyond the pale are now considered normal, and in part, I think, because of his metapragmatics. In particular, right, I focus on three discursive moves that qualify as metapragmatic, and that's gaslighting, boomeranging, and co-opting in common parlance. Gaslighting, where you confuse people about the facts and distort what's going on so that they sort of step back and can't really challenge you as effectively. Boomeranging, where you push back what they say and apply it to them rather than to yourself. And co-opting, where you steal their ideas and identities and endorse them as your own. So, like in order, I don't actually do this in the book, though I do this in an essay that's coming out now with Social Research. Take the January 6th insurrection. So gaslighting is like Tucker Carlson saying it's an inside job, that the deep state really was behind the January 6th insurrection. That's a profoundly disturbing, outrageous, extremist gaslight that unfortunately a lot of people believe now. And boomeranging is where critics say, well, Trump is trying to dismantle our democracy by encouraging violence to stop the peaceful transfer of power on January 6th. And you boomerang back, no, we were standing up for democracy because you stole the election, as Trump still continues to insist. And co-opting is where a lot of people say, well, we are the proponents of democracy, of civil rights, of facts, transparency, et cetera, et cetera. And Trump takes on that mantle and says, no, he's the one who wants the truth to come out about what's going on. And so these are separable, I argue in the book, but they often interact. And actually, I think, the most popular one is gaslighting. And but when you look at gaslighting, you often see in the case of Trump that his gaslighting involves boomeranging and co-opting, whether it's about January 6th or about immigration or about race relations in the United States, or about weaponizing the law for political effect. These are all examples I examine in the book, and these are all things that I think he's been pretty successful, at least within the Republican Party, to continue to stay on top of it. And that's basically the argument in my book. And I, conclude by saying that this is really dangerous stuff. It encourages stochastic terrorism, where you're encouraging other people on the basis of this rhetoric to go out and commit violent acts, or it encourages people to want to be done with democracy and move to a more authoritarian kind of government. And we're seeing all of this unfold now as Trump continues to practice this discourse of Trumpism. That's basically my book. I try to, be optimistic at the end that we'll get beyond this, but it's hard. I don't want to be too optimistic because every day it seems like there's another reason not to be.
Good.
So I think that's, it'll get pretty boring if I keep going.
Do you think that Trump does this strategically, or does he just say what comes out of his mouth?
Right. Well, I think it's kind of both. So, like, he's a one-trick pony. He's been this way his whole life. Ivanka Trump, his daughter, at one point years ago when he was running the first time in 2016, said that Trump wasn't really pugilistic. He's a counterpuncher. He only attacks people when he's attacked. He fights back. Now, I don't think that that's really true, but it highlights how this was sort of known in his family, that he could be aggressive and so on. Trump famously tells this story, I don't think he tells it much anymore, that when he was in grade school, he punched his music teacher because he didn't like how they were teaching. There's no evidence this actually happened, but he's really proud of that. So he's always been very pugilistic and combative and argumentative, and he's never wrong, and he denies, and like lots of women have accused him of sexual assault, and he practices what women advocates call DARVO: deny, attack, reverse, victim and offender. And that's what he does. He's for years, he always does that. He never admits he's wrong. If he's attacked, he attacks back. He denies it. He demonizes the victim and claims that he's really the real victim. Like he suggests that whites are the new victims of discrimination, and so on. So he's allowed this personality to sort of spill over into his politics. And his personality is very central to Trumpism as a
So,
discourse. So in
so
some
you,
ways, it's learned, and he just continues to enact it.
so if it's learned, um, are you saying that he had this before his um, famous association with Roy Cohn, who laid out these principles of attack?
Right. That's one of the regrets I have. This has already been pointed out to me. Why didn't I mention Roy Cohn in my book? And yeah, I forgot. I was too busy with other things. So yeah, we don't really know to what extent the story that Roy Cohn taught him all these tactics and so on and so forth. Um, but he definitely warmed to it. So there's no doubt that Roy Cohn was influential. I don't know if he's the origin of all of this, though.
Well, if I could jump in here for a second,
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
I think, before I forget, let me mention I actually grew up right near Stony Brook, and when you were talking about Nichols Road, that brought back a lot of memories. Um, the, you know, and my book is not a biography of Trump either, and I don't think Sandy's is, and I don't think it's necessary. But if anything, Roy Cohn taught him how to deal with um, a crisis, deal with how to push back when you are under threat from some kind of legal or whatever situation. That's very different from convincing people to vote for you. So I think that's a piece of how he deals. What he learned from Roy Cohn is probably a piece of how he deals in the political arena, but I don't see it exactly as the main strategy. And in terms of him, I think I don't think he sat down and said to himself, I'd like to be president. What's the best communications approach I can, figure out in order to do that? He just happened upon one that is brilliant because it's who he is. He honed it through his life experience, through his shenanigans over the decades, and he does what works. And not even that he does what he does, and it happened to work. And I think that's the best way to understand him. But it is stupidly brilliant in its own way. I mean, I think he's the most effective political communicator. He's certainly of this era. I mean, you want to compare him to Barack Obama; they're so different. But I think you could say certainly they're equally, they're equally effective. But I think what Sandy said is really important is that he used it to take over the Republican Party, which was sort of a necessary but not sufficient step. And it's all because of his rhetorical style that he defeated Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz. It certainly wasn't, it was because he stood out in a field of 17 using his rhetoric. And then through some other circumstances, including luck and James Comey, he got through the general election. But, the rhetoric, I don't even think the rhetoric helped him that much in the general election, but it was in the Republican Party that it was 100% of his success.
To what degree would you say that he had the advantage, the time was ripe for this tactic? I think that played something of a role. He stepped into a situation where people were frustrated and wanted to hear about bad guys. Other people, jump in.
Well, Sandy, I really appreciate this. I don't know of your work before reading a few of the chapters that Frank had sent along and hearing your introduction now. What I find attractive, and Ian, it is interesting, the conflict, the connection between what you did in your book and what Sandy is doing is really fascinating to me. And I think, Sandy, part of what I find appealing, and this is maybe my own background, is that there is a kind of a sociology of knowledge moment here. There is a question of, and I love this focus on language and the metapragmatic orientation, how does the very language that gets used mold the way we perceive the world? And what are these tactics and the gaslighting, the boomeranging, the co-opting? I find that really valuable because it's a lens through which we can begin to understand the power of a certain way of speaking. And I guess, Sandy, this is where I had two questions. One, I think it's probably at the heart of what you write. How does such a strategy, how does such a linguistic shaping gain legitimacy? How exactly is this? What is the process of this? You use the word, Sandy, like how it gets normalized, but how does it gain a kind of legitimacy so it's taken for granted as a way of understanding? And I guess the second thing that maybe is a little later in our discussion that I think is really crucial is how does it lose legitimacy?
Right.
And I think that this is, also connected. Maybe this is just my lens in if you think about this, kind of from a Weberian perspective as charismatic authority, part of the Weber orientation is that charismatic authority is unbelievably unstable. It can't sustain itself over time. So part of my question, Sandy, not only is how does it gain legitimacy, but how does it lose legitimacy? And how do contradictions emerge over time that undercut its authority? And, from a Weber point of view, it's going to get moved either into a kind of a legal, rational orientation or become a kind of traditional authority, but that it can't remain charismatic. So he has this problem of how do you perpetuate a certain kind of linguistic orientation that has fantastic power, and how does it begin to lose? How does it lose some of its potency over time? And how do we look for those contradictions? So I hope that that's useful.
Yeah,
In a silly
no,
way,
very useful.
I was
Yeah,
going to ask myself, when does gaslighting run out of gas? So you have the floor. Said,
Well, Alan, thank you for that. That is brilliant. I do discuss in I think the penultimate chapter that Trump is a charismatic leader of a movement, as much as people are loath to want to admit that. And I use Weber, and I talk about that. So thanks for that. And Frank, you earlier mentioned, like how did we get to this moment and what are the forces? Yeah, it's kind of like a perfect storm in the sense that there are a lot of people. There are people in my family. There are people in my neighborhood. There are people across the country that were waiting for someone like Trump to come along. And so he benefits from that he's building off a pre-existing movement of white resentment that's been there for a long time. When you go back to the early 1920s and the Ku Klux Klan being involved with the Democratic Party to limit immigration, or you go to McCarthyism, or you go to the Tea Party. There has always been this white resentment movement out there to various extent. And he's building off of that, and he's mainstreaming and normalizing that kind of extremist thinking to the extent that we have, I don't think, ever seen. Um, Woodrow Wilson was sympathetic to the Klan, but he wasn't really a Klan member, whereas Trump is the head of the MAGA movement and he's president of the United States. That's quite remarkable that he's been able to do that by building off a pre-existing movement that's always been there, the sort of underside of American white democracy, and our tendency to see the United States in Christian nationalist terms, a heron folk democracy of sorts. Unfortunately, it's not really been the dominant strain in our politics until Trump. So he's been able to do this in part, I argue, by the way he and his followers talk, whether it's Tucker Carlson or Marjorie Taylor Greene until she had her falling out recently, or other people like J.D. Vance who come along, often by trying to what I call a post-civil rights kind of discourse where they deny what they're actually doing, where they're gaslighting and boomeranging and co-opting. I think this is fairly distinctive to Trumpism as a discourse, even though these things go on before Trump came along and they'll go on afterwards. The extent to which they lean on that to use subterfuge rather than exalt white supremacy like U.S. senators used to do, say, like in the 1930s and 40s in Congress, on the floor of the Senate, right? We don't do that anymore. Instead, we engage in Trumpism, where we deny what we're actually saying. I mean, there are very few U.S. senators that want to exalt white supremacy. Maybe one or two if you cornered them, but so it's a very different kind of discourse now, where you normalize it by denying it, using subterfuge, by saying it's just what the other side is doing, or you adopt their identity as the virtuous ones. That's a little bit distinctive, I think. And how... Yes, I think I'm very much taken with Weber's thinking on this. So I do agree that charismatic authority is very unstable and dangerous. I mean, Weber was ambivalent about it, I think. I don't want to get too much into a debate about that because I'm, a little bit over my skis there on that. But it seems like Weber was not a big fan of bureaucracy and how soulless it was and alienating. And he thought a little charismatic movement might be able to challenge that. But he was also worried how dangerous that was. Very unstable, yes. And but I've learned a long time ago I should not predict the future at all when it comes to American politics. So I don't know how long and in what form this will continue to take.
So to what degree do you think this has taken place and or been augmented by social media, which is a unique form we didn't have, and it has the advantage of being able to speak about people without having to see them or confront them, meaning you can say more outrageous things than you would in their presence.
Yeah, no, I in the first chapter of the book, I talk about the various forces like a perfect storm that brought this together, and the changing media landscape is one of them. And I try to suggest that, that Trump, in his own way, has been tutored by people like Steve Bannon and others to speak in the terms that work on social media. And he developed his own little niche there. And he likes to, now he has his own platform, Truth Social. So yes, exactly, where he just says outrageous things. So here's a good metapragmatic example of his use of social media, I think. So back in the day when he first started running and he got accused of like posting neo-Nazi memes or saying outrageous racist things, and he would say, no, that was just a retweet. That wasn't me. I was just retweeting what somebody said. And people can decide for themselves whether it's true or not. That's a, a typical Trump move. So for a long time before he started to run for president, I wrote an article about this about 10 years ago, actually. Emily Flitter, she writes about Wall Street now, but she started out a young woman from Smith College. She was a reporter for Reuters, and she contacted me because I had written something along these lines. And she introduced me to this term, amphetamine. She said Trump speaks in amphetamine. That's where he leaves it up to the audience to decide what he's saying. Like people are saying, it's not me, right? He's distancing himself. That's like a retweet, right? So he's practicing amphetamine to maintain deniability. And what I argue in the book, he's gone way beyond that now to gaslighting and boomeranging and co-opting and his acolytes practicing that along with him because it's been so effective. So there's not really all that amphetamine anymore, but every once in a while you'll hear that, whether it's like yesterday talking about Ukraine. He did some amphetamines. Leaving it up to, or Venezuela, he leaves it up to other people to decide. He still falls into that. So yes, he's been acclimated to social media to normalize his extremism, and a lot of people that follow him practice the same thing now.
So,
Can I ask
others?
a question? Yeah.
Sure.
One, well, I like the book in the terms of narratives. I think narratives are really important in American politics. We should be looking at narratives even more than we always have been. But one thing that seemed to be missing is a discussion of Trump as a demagogue, and the Madison and Hamilton and Washington, they were obsessed with the idea that a demagogue would come along and take over the system. That was really their big concern. And, the Federalist Papers are sort of littered with either references to it or they're alluding to it. So like three questions. First, do you think that Trump is a demagogue? Do you think a demagogue is different from a fascist or an authoritarian? And can you rationalize the language of a demagogue? Because a demagogue is almost by its nature irrational in its narratives. And so anyway, I'm curious about what your take is on him as a demagogue.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. That's a great point. So I do discuss in the first chapter of the book that Trump is basically a demagogue. I don't discuss how, and I don't think it's really mutually exclusive whether an authoritarian fascist has to be a demagogue or not. A demagogue is someone who lies to the people to get their support and for their own benefit and in seizing and maintaining power, and they could do it as a fascist or as an authoritarian and so on. I don't actually analyze that. And I have a chapter on Trump's authoritarian turn and in particular, his use of language associated with fascism. As opposed to, I'm not really in a position to say whether Trump is a fascist or not, or whether he's an authoritarian or whatever, but he dabbles in this language and he gets to normalize it by practicing meta pragmatics. And that's something a demagogue would do. And he's definitely a demagogue. I mean, this is all largely about he and his supporters getting power and seizing power and maintaining power as an end in itself for their own benefit, like, you know, including, greatly increasing his wealth now, which if I had known that he was going to like go from 2 billion to 11 billion in 6 months, I would have put that in the book as well. Yeah, he's a demagogue who's
If we assume he's a
lying
demagogue,
to the people for his own ends.
kind of following on what Alan was talking about, if we assume he's one, that's not really transferable. In other words, a demagogue can't say, J.D. Vance, in other words, is not going to be able to be a demagogue, much as he may want to, nor Marco Rubio or anybody else. If we go to, so do we assume that Trump's demagogueness is transferable to somebody else?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I try to address that in the last chapter of the book. So in the last chapter of the book, right, it got edited out because Trump won. But at one point, Adam Schiff was like on MSNBC or whatever. Now it's called MS Now. And he was being interviewed. And they asked him, well, I forget who was interviewing him, do you think Trump, what happens to the movement after Trump goes away? And Adam Schiff at the time, because they were confident that he was going to get convicted of some major crimes there, because of the indictments by Jack Smith. And he said, no, I think it's all going to go away. Trump is a uniquely gifted arsonist, is what Adam Schiff said. I had that in the book, but I took it out because he got reelected. So yeah, I agree with Schiff, and I agree with what you're saying, Jerry, that it's not really transferable. He's uniquely gifted as this charismatic demagogue who normalizes extremist rhetoric to get and maintain power for his own personal benefit and those who support him. Yes, I agree that J.D. Vance, and I talk about him in the book as someone who helps normalize Trump's extremism. But that doesn't mean he's going to be as extremist or as effective or charismatic or demagogic as Trump. I will say this, though, as I'm thinking about this right now, that whoever, replaces him atop this movement doesn't have to be a demagogue in order for the movement to continue to be successful. This is only part of what has made this happen. Like Weber talks about the routinization of charisma, where it gets channeled into the bureaucracy and so on. Maybe it's tamed or domesticated a little bit. It can still be pretty bad. So I guess that's one way of looking at it, unfortunately.
Well, I found it interesting reading Michelle Goldberg the other day, who said, back in April, we didn't know which way this was going to go. And I think you and I actually had a talk about this in a cafe in Manhattan. It was really unclear. But she says now it's more clear that he's in trouble. And what she gave for her reason, which I thought was really interesting, is that despite his rhetoric, he's been unable to consolidate power in the country, which would be, I think, a formula for a fascist takeover, for example. There's too much opposition to him. She says he's still a dangerous guy and bad things can happen, but he hasn't pulled the country together. In the contrary.
Yeah, yes and no, I guess, so like, what's her name? Ruth Ben-Ghiat from NYU. So she argues, right, like it doesn't have to be a majority. A minority will do just fine to seize and maintain power, to overturn democracy. We don't want to use a democratic lens for understanding what's going on here because this is not about maintaining democracy, it's about overturning it. And so he can lose a lot of support and still get away with a lot. And he has, right? He's astoundingly unpopular in public opinion polls, right? And his policies are unpopular as well, right? And yet he's still enacting them to the detriment of like all kinds of people around the world. Like, what are they estimating? Several 100,000 children in Africa have died because of what they've done to USAID. Okay, so that's not necessarily a fascist takeover, but it's a tragedy of great proportions. How many people died because of his mishandling of COVID? Because he didn't want to admit he was wrong about anything. He could do a lot of damage. And the people who follow him, who may not, be as charismatic or demagogic or even as authoritarian, they can continue to like really accelerate the democratic erosion.
One of the things that is totally astonishing is the degree to which people in other parts of the world, particularly here in Germany, follow this. And on some occasions, he's the top news in Germany and the news. So I'm wondering what people in Thailand do. Do they follow this? What do they think? You have an authoritarian government, you see parallels. What would you say?
Yeah, from our side, the different part of the world in Asia, I would say we worry very much about him, especially his taxation policy, and of course, the progressive movement in Asia. A bit worry because usually we refer to the US democracy as the model, but now we cannot do that anymore. So something that a bit difficult to, I mean, for the progressive movement here to thinking about the model for them to advocate for. So that's the problem. I just want to go back to the rhetoric. I think it's very interesting that you point it out because I totally agree. It's very important to focus on the role of the rhetoric, but I'm not quite sure how far you engage into the emotional expression. I think I'm not quite sure, but I assume emotional expression is part of the rhetoric, right? And I think Trump and his people has a very, the wonderful skill in using emotional expression. His emotional appeal very, very powerful. I'm not quite sure how far you discuss on that.
No, that's a great question. I mean, so in political science in the United States, I think there's growing appreciation, right, that Trumpism as a movement is part of a global phenomenon of a lot of, across a lot of different countries, a kind of resurgent nativism, especially regarding issues of immigration and so on, that have pushed extremist right-wing parties more to the foreground, if not taking over the government, whether it's in Asia or in Europe or in South America now. You see this sometimes with active support from Trump himself. And so it's a global phenomenon that a lot of people are talking about. like Pippa Norris and Ronald Inglehart, I think, were early on in calling this out, and but others as well, that I try to mention in the book. And I think that's just something to be concerned about. And these people who track democracy around the world are saying that there's been a lot of democratic erosion in a lot of different countries, and authoritarianism's on the rise, and democracy's declining. And it's a reversal of like 30 years of growth in democratic countries emerging in the world. And so that's something to be concerned about. On the issue of how the rhetoric taps into emotion, I think, again, a lot of political scientists in the United States have been interested in this idea of what they call effective polarization, which is where now the parties are so polarized, and it's more like, well, I just have to be for my side that I identify with if it is to oppose the other side. And it's not really rational. It's not really based on policy. It's just about your side winning. I see this in my neighborhood. I see this with some of my friends. I see this in my family. I see this in the country generally. We're so polarized, and it's become more an issue of emotion. A lot of people buy into some of the craziest stuff Trump says just because that's what their side is arguing about. I've had conversations with people who support Trump's idea that the forest fires in California are caused by the fact that Governor Newsom doesn't rake the leaves enough in national forests, overlooking that Trump's in charge of the national forests, not the not the governor. So it doesn't matter that none of that makes any sense. That's their position now, right? Trump released a lot of water that was held in certain lakes and so on in Northern California to put out the Palisades fires in Los Angeles. And someone asked him, well, why'd you do that? And he said, well, I assumed all the lakes are connected. And I guess he also assumed that lakes in the north, when you release water from them, it goes south. I don't know why, but I know people who support him in that. That is ridiculous, but that's what their side is supposed to say now. So it's very emotional. It's my sideism, it's called. And unfortunately, it's, making American politics a lot dumber.
Well, we know, and we see it on issues that are not so dumb either. Either, right? I mean, before Trump came along, the Republican Party was basically an orthodox party in favor of free trade. Trump single-handedly changed that. Republican public opinion is now very protectionist, and it was not before 2016. It just was not. And he moved them. He absolutely moved them. I think the one to get at, we're looking at rhetoric, but we also want to talk about the content of the rhetoric. And immigration is really the key. Trump, the one thing where Trump, I think, followed rather than just was where he was immigration. Right before and this was some of the things, before 2012, Trump really wasn't an anti-immigrant figure. He was a birther, and he had his outer borough New York racism for a lot of reasons. But he wasn't particularly interested in immigration. And this is one of the things I found was when he started thinking about seriously in 2014, 2015, he had one of his flunkies do a little bit of research and basically said, what are they talking about on right-wing talk radios? And he recognized, how do I stand out? Well, I stand out in the Republican Party by getting the energy. And basically he came back to me and said, listen, they're talking about immigration and borders and sovereignty. That certainly was what Limbaugh was talking about, and others. And if you look at the famous speech where he announces for president, Mexicans coming across the border are rapists, drug dealers. And that wasn't even he had like a line about that in the prepared remarks, but he just went off on it because he'd been told, well, as you mentioned, Sandy, those are the kind of remarks that would sink a candidacy. Well, those are the remarks that took him from 2% to the nomination, basically. He never looked back after he made that speech. And that's what's so incredible. So there, I think, is one area where he saw where people were and went there. And it is part of this global movement, this nativist movement. It's the one, it's an area where change, because there are other areas of change that people are afraid of, but immigration is an area of change that the government has a real role to play. Like, the government can't stop people from being trans or whatever people are scared about in the moment. But the government can set the immigration policies and the asylum. So they can say, all right, President, I'm scared of immigration. Stop it. And Trump can say, I will. And it's a real clear connection.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's great. I didn't know that wasn't part of his prepared remarks.
Yeah, one line. It was
Yeah,
one line, but
yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I talk in the book about Trump being totally transactional from day one. He's an opportunistic kind of person. He jumps upon top of movement because he sees an opportunity for him to ascend in the Republican Party, which he had not been a member of for like ever. And yeah, he's very opportunistic. He's very transactional. If you tell him that Fox News is on, he right away has to watch it because he's got to find out what they're thinking. I talk about this in the book. It's not really clear whether Fox News is repeating what Trump wants said or whether he's repeating what Fox News is saying he should say. And it's not really, it's kind of like a vicious cycle almost where they're sort of playing off each other. Yeah, he's very opportunistic about all of this. And that's what makes it so dangerous.
Can I ask another kind of unrelated question? Your three, gaslighting, boomeranging, and co-opting, do you think that those should be countered, or do you think that people should adopt them?
Yeah, no, that's it's like playing with fire. I think that's kind of dangerous. The Democratic Party's not been about emotion; it's been about reason, right? And that's a big contrast. And the Republican Party has been using emotion very effectively for a long time, even before Trump. And the Democratic Party wants facts, and it wants science, and it wants reason, it wants sound public policy, and that's been losing lately. So it's tempting, but I don't think that that's going to be good for us in the long run. I mean, these things like facts, science, reason, rationality that the Democratic Party tends to steer towards to be consistent with its more educated base and so on. These are foundations of liberal democracy. And so there's a more fundamental problem, right, beyond whether the Democratic Party gets back in power, and is will liberal democracy survive? Especially in a time where its foundations are eroding.
Do you think there's a clever way of using those things that can be more reasonable at the end? Is there some way you can use gaslighting, boomeranging, and co-opting to essentially get you back to reason somehow or another? Because obviously those strategies are working. And so, politicians, they go for what works.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. So like I don't discuss that at the end of my book, and maybe I should have, even if I don't come down on, let's go into that. I mean, Gavin Newsom is trying, right? I don't find what he's doing that effective for me, but maybe it's working for other people. He's trying to be like a more humorous, lighthearted counter to Trumpist discourse. by making fun of him, calling him names, putting out memes that disparage him and the movement. Uh, so maybe there's a more lighthearted, jovial, kind of emotional based approach that people might find uplifting and it's personally not my kind of thing, but yeah, maybe it would something
Yeah.
like that might be needed.
Alan.
Say, I just wanted to, sorry, a more basic thing that I heard you saying that seems very, very powerful to me. And it is a connection to this affective dimension. But I think it has to do with the spectacular success in normalizing, this is back to the language, normalizing a certain way in which people can speak to and about each other, which to me is astonishing. If you had a 10-year-old kid who came home and said, there's a new kid in my class, and you're a parent and you say, well, what do you think? And the kid says, the person's just trash. The person's just trash. As a parent, you wouldn't, I think, whatever your political persuasion, you wouldn't put up with that. You'd ask a question, why are you saying? And yet, here we are on a daily basis listening to a kind of escalation of language in a certain direction that I think had no public legitimacy. It could have had private legitimacy. You could say that to a friend, but the very fact that public language has been so twisted to accept that way of describing, talking, to me is I mean, to say victory is extraordinary, but it is a kind of a victory of a worldview that I just don't remember.
Yeah.
It is a normalization that I just find astonishing that we don't pause and say, excuse me, this guy, the president of the United States, has just talked about a whole country as scum or a type of a person as well. It's taken for granted that someone can do that. And I find that just beyond belief as a process of normalizing.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I mean, you guys are pointing out important issues that I don't really fully pursue. I think I was tired by the time I got to the last chapter, and I don't really pursue these that much. So like if you take what was I just thinking of? Like the way Trump demonizes the female reporters, right? And people say, well, gee, that's not right to, call them piggy or ugly or, what does that have to do with a rational exchange about public policy coming out of the Oval Office and so on and so forth? Or, I think some Republicans, even ones who are kind of outrageous on social media, like James Wood, the actor, called out Trump for what he said about the murder of Rob Reiner and his wife by their allegedly by their son. What a tragedy, right? And Trump just says all this horrible stuff, and James Wood, okay, that's going too far, right? But he's still, pro-Trump, right? So there's a little bit of that my-sidism, that effective polarization. Okay, that's too far. We can't have that, but you're still our guy.
Right.
because you've been chosen by God or whatever to, so I know people who say that Trump is the greatest thing that's ever happened to the Catholic Church. In other words, regardless of everything he says, because
Hmm.
he's saving us from secularism or atheism or whatever. And so people have their own kind of transactional relationship with Trump. He's our guy. He does
Right.
our work for us. Unfortunately, some of that is very cruel. So Adam Swearer in the Atlantic a couple years ago wrote, I think it's the title of his collection of essays from the Atlantic called "Cruelty is the Point." Right? The idea is that that's not what I call it. It's the main point. It's not just some side thing that a lot of people are there for the cruelty, unfortunately, that they've been harboring because they have white resentment towards multiculturalism or what have you. And unfortunately, Trump is giving voice to what they've been saying privately or thinking. And so there's that as well, that for some people, he hasn't gone far enough yet.
Right.
So it's a really bad time. Who's it? Bethil, the French theorist, talks about the psychological structure of fascism. So this is a fascist mentality to want to not just overturn democracy, but violently subordinate the opposition in your life, in your private life. And there is this kind of mentality that has been boiling over, mostly privately in the United States, which we don't want to forget, right, is a historically very violent country where lots of people act out a lot of unhealthy kinds of thinking about their neighbors and their fellow Americans. And um, that's sort of the real underside of Trumpism.
I would like to say that we don't want to forget when we say that this has become normalized, that at least half of us don't accept this. I think that's an important political fact. We reject this. We don't know what to do about it, but we speak about it. I think there are also some interesting developments along these lines. About a week ago, what was it in response to the event where Trump, what did he do? What did he say? It was totally outrageous. Where Jake Tapper on CNN sort of stopped and he said, "This is crazy. This is not something we do. This is over the top. This is psychologically problematic." And he had a doctor there to also say what constitutes abnormal behavior. It was one of the first times where I've seen in the mainstream media people with shows to step out and say, okay, that's not good. That's over the line. That's not who we are. Before that, they always skirted around that. If that's your view, you would interpret it from what they were saying, but they wouldn't exactly say it because what? They don't want to get sued. So I don't think he's completely won us over. I don't think anybody sitting here would say they would accept this. And the question is, at what point can that break out into the open and become normal to say the man's nuts? I think another development too to consider is we're talking all the time about the base. He's talking to the base. He's talking to the base, but we get these signs now that the base is cracking a bit. For example, he was not supposed to go on foreign wars. Here's Green out there saying, could you think about us at home instead of worrying about Putin or Iran or Venezuela? So at some point, if the base starts to fight among themselves, I mean, some in the base stay with him, that's for sure. They don't care what he does. It's good. But if they start fighting about themselves, I wonder how much his rhetoric will have the resonance that it has. I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's an important question.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, most social movements
Go ahead, Sandy.
eventually decline. So, yeah.
Say again?
let's also not overestimate. Let's not overestimate the success, right? Trump's, in terms of what Sandy and I have written about, his rhetorical success is what enabled him to take over the Republican Party. 2016, he was on his way to losing an election. If you didn't have the email scandal, he would have lost the election. If there's any question about that, he lost the popular vote by 2.5 million people. We have a quirky electoral system that allows the second place finisher to win. So it's not as if he went out and convinced a majority of Americans that his way was the right way. He was able to convince a majority of Republicans, and that was a real success, and he did that in a thumping fashion. He lost in 2020. 2024, pardon my French, was a shit show because Joe Biden collapsed at the weakest point, at the most vulnerable point of the campaign. You had inflation, you had terrible metrics that hurt the incumbent party. Trump knows how to motivate his base, which was enough to get him the nomination and win him control of the party. It's maybe a third of the country. The other people who voted for him, they vote for him in spite of his rhetoric, not because of it. They either hate the Democrat, and even some of his base, they hate the Democrats more, they hate woke, whatever. So let's not overestimate. I think it's an important point to recognize that there is arguably, even throughout his political triumphs, a majority against him, maybe a slight majority against him, certainly if you look at the people who don't vote. But the question is what, as scholars, what can we understand from his rhetoric? And this question of transferability is really important. Is there another person who can come along and eke out another victory? And, those are, that's future prediction, and prognostication that we're not going to get through. But let's not overestimate. It's become, and that was the other piece I wanted to come back to real fast, on normalization. You had 20 years at least where in the public discourse, the norm was, no, you can't say that. And we were constantly expanding the no, you can't say that. And it doesn't, now we got in the mid 20-teens, it wasn't even, well, what you said, you're really intending to discriminate against people. It became, you may not have been intending to discriminate against people, but some people found it offensive. So you're wrong. Trump came along and said, essentially, screw that. I'm going to say what I want. And all of the people who were frustrated by that said, right, he speaks for me. He speaks for me. So that's the base. The people who want to talk that way, who do talk that way in private, who would say to their kid, yeah, that person probably is trash. And now I got somebody who's out there saying it. That's the bond. And that's hard to break. It can, and if it breaks a little bit here and there, he didn't have, it wasn't the majority to begin with, but that's the bond.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
Appreciate the question.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Yeah, it's been a great discussion.
You have the last word, Sandy.
Well, yeah, no, this has been a great discussion. I've learned a lot to think about. One fatal flaw I have as a writer is I'm always tempted then, I got to write another book or I got to write another article. I have to correct all these mistakes I made or all these things I
overlooked. You weren't going to
overlooked.
write this one.
Yeah, it just came out. I know it's kind of sad, but I would, yeah. So normalization, right, is something he's tried and hasn't, and the movement generally has tried and hasn't been entirely successful. But normalization doesn't have to win elections to be successful.
That's
All
right.
right. You,
That's
you
right.
can, it gets normalized even if you lose elections. It now becomes part of our politics. And that's one fear I have because, again, I think I've become more politically conservative since Trump came on the scene. So I spent a lot of years being democratic socialist who was critical of our capitalist democracy, generating lots of poverty and inequality and adversity for people on the bottom of the socioeconomic order. And then Trump comes along, and I realize, well, you can't really have social democracy without a liberal democratic order where we honor the Constitution, the rule of law, where we believe in civil political discourse, et cetera, et cetera. And I moved more towards trying to protect that uh, from Trumpism. And I still see that as a major threat, irrespective of whether they're going to win the next election or not.
Well,
I'm sorry, Frank, I know you're trying to end this.
Alan,
I
we
just
have
wanted to
time.
say, Sandy, that's why I think that the New York City experience over the next 4 years will be fascinating in terms of all of this meta-pragmatics, linguistic moves, a totally different language, a totally different way of thinking of a mayor, young guy, thinks in totally different terms, very, very different strategies. And so I think we will have an astonishing moment of two very different, putting on the level of linguistic visions of how to talk about politics and how to talk about people and how people can find in them language that resonates with their experience.
Yeah, no, it's great. Yeah, one of my former students is a top advisor to Danny, and she came to my class at Stony Brook in the fall and talked to my current students, and it was quite a joy. And she really was motivating people. It's very exciting.
Okay, with that, we can say thank you very much, Sandy.
Thank you. It was great.
And
I enjoyed it.
we'll be in touch.
Yeah,
Thanks very much.
look forward
Good
to
luck
it.
Thanks,
with the book,
everyone.
Sandy. Tremendous.
Thank you.
And
Thank you
job,
all.
Sandy.
It was great.
That's
Happy
great.
New
Bye.
Year in advance.
Very much to
New
you.
Year.
Bye, Piyapong.
Bye-bye.
See you. Ian.
Take care, everyone.